They are the highest mountains in the circumpolar regions, replied Barbicane. They have been measured with the greatest care. Newton is 23,000 feet high. More or less, laughed Arden. What Delphic oracle says so? Dear friend, replied Barbicane quietly, the visible mountains of the moon have been measured so carefully and so accurately that I should hardly hesitate in affirming their altitude to be as well known as that of Mont Blanc, or, at least, as those of the chief peaks in the Himalayas or the Rocky Mountain range. I should like to know how people set about it, observed Arden incredulously. There are several well-known methods of approaching this problem, replied Barbicane, and as these methods, though founded on different principles, bring us constantly to the same result, we may pretty safely conclude that our calculations are right. We have no time just now to draw diagrams, but, if I express myself clearly, you will no doubt easily catch the general principle. Go ahead, answered Arden, anything but algebra. We want no algebra now, said Barbicane. It can't enable us to find principles, though it certainly enables us to apply them. Well, the sun at a certain altitude shines on one side of a mountain and flings a shadow on the other. The length of this shadow is easily found by means of a telescope, whose object glass is provided with a micrometer. This consists simply of two parallel spider threads, one of which is stationary and the other movable, the moon's real diameter being known and occupying a certain space on the object glass. The exact space occupied by the shadow can be easily ascertained by means of the movable thread. This space, compared with the moon's space, will give us the length of the shadow. Now, as under the same circumstances a certain height can cast only a certain shadow, of course a knowledge of the one must give you that of the other, and vice versa. This method, stated roughly, was that followed by Galileo, and in our own day by Beer and Meidler with extraordinary success. I certainly see some sense in this method, said Arden, if they took extraordinary pains to observe correctly. The least carelessness would set them wrong, not only by feet but by miles. We have time enough, however, to listen to another method before we get into the full blaze of the glorious old Sol. The other method, interrupted 1000 Nicholl, laying down his telescope to rest his eyes, and now joining in the conversation to give himself something to do, is called that of the tangent rays. A solar ray, barely passing the edge of the moon's surface, is caught on the peak of a mountain the rest of which lies in shadow. The distance between this starry peak and the line separating the light from the darkness we measure carefully by means of our telescope. Then, I see it at a glance, interrupted Arden with lighting eye. The ray, being a tangent, of course makes right angles with the radius which is known. Consequently we have two sides and one angle, quite enough to find the other parts of the triangle. Very ingenious, but now that I think of it, is not this method absolutely impracticable for every mountain except those in the immediate neighborhood of the light and shadow line? That's a defect easily remedied by patience, explained Barbicane, the captain, who did not like being interrupted, having withdrawn to his telescope. As this line is continually changing, in course of time all the mountains must come near it. A third method, to measure the mountain profile directly by means of the micrometer, is evidently applicable only to altitudes lying exactly on the lunar rim. That is clear enough, said Arden, and another point is also very clear. In full moon no measurement is possible. When no shadows are made, none can be measured. Measurements, right or wrong, are possible only when the solar rays strike the moon's surface obliquely with regard to the observer. Am I right, Signor Barbicane, Maestro Illustrissimo? Perfectly right, replied Barbicane. You are an apt pupil. Say that again, said Arden. I want Mac to hear it. Barbicane humoured him by repeating the observation, but 1000 Nicholl would only notice it by a grunt of doubtful meaning. Was Galileo tolerably successful in his calculations? Asked Arden, resuming the conversation. Before answering this question, Barbicane unrolled the map of the moon, which a faint light like that of daybreak now enabled him to examine. He then went on. Galileo was wonderfully successful, considering that the telescope which he employed was a poor instrument of his own construction, magnifying only 30 times. He gave the lunar mountains a height of about 26,000 feet, an altitude cut down by Hevelius, but almost doubled by Riccioli. Herschel was the first to come pretty close to the truth, but Beer and Meidler, whose Mappa Selenographica now lies before us, have left really nothing more to be done for lunar astronomy, except, of course, to pay a personal visit to the moon, which we have tried to do, but I fear with a very poor prospect of success. Cheer up, cried Arden. It's not all over yet by long odds. Who can say what is still in store for us? Another bolide may shunt us off our ellipse and even send us to the moon's surface. Then, seeing Barbicane shake his head ominously, and his countenance become more and more depressed, this true friend tried to brighten him up a bit by feigning to take deep interest in a subject that to him was absolutely the driest in the world. Beer and Meidler, he went on, must have measured at least 40 or 50 mountains to their satisfaction. 40 or 50, exclaimed Barbicane. They measured no fewer than 1,095 lunar mountains and crater summits with a perfect success. 6 of these reach an altitude of upwards of 18,000 feet, and 22 are more than 15,000 feet high. Which is the highest in the lot? Asked Ardan, keenly relishing Barbicane's earnestness. Doerful in the southern hemisphere, the peak of which I have just pointed out, is the highest of the lunar mountains so far measured, replied Barbicane. It is nearly 25,000 feet high. Indeed, 5,000 feet lower than Mount Everest. Still, for a lunar mountain, it is quite a respectable altitude. Respectable? Why, it's an enormous altitude, my dear friend, if you compare it with the moon's diameter. The Earth's diameter being more than 312 times greater than the moon's, if the Earth's mountains bore the same ratio to those of the moon, Everest should be more than 16 miles high, whereas it is not quite 6. How do the general heights of the Himalayas compare with those of the highest lunar mountains? Asked Ardan, wondering what would be his next question. 15 peaks in the eastern or higher division of the Himalayas are higher than the loftiest lunar peaks, replied Barbicane. Even in the western or lower section of the Himalayas, some of the peaks exceed Doerful. Which are the chief lunar mountains that exceed Mont Blanc in altitude? Asked Ardan, bravely suppressing a yawn. The following dozen ranged, if my memory does not fail me, in the exact order of their respective heights, replied Barbicane, never wearied in answering such questions. Newton, Curtius, Cassatus, Rata, Short, Huygens, Biancanus, Tycho, Kircher, Clavius, Endymion, and Catharina. Now those not quite up to Mont Blanc, asked Ardan, hardly knowing what to say. Here they are, about half a dozen of them: Mortus, Theophilus, Harpalus, Eratosthenes, Werner, and Piccolomini, answered Barbicane, as ready as a schoolboy reciting his lesson, and pointing them out on the map as quickly as a compositor distributing his type. The next in rank? Asked Ardan, astounded at his friend's wonderful memory. The next in rank, replied Barbicane promptly, are those about the size of the Matterhorn, that is to say about 2-3-4 miles in height. They are Macrobius, Delambre, and Canaan. Come, he added, seeing Ardan hesitating and at a loss what other question to ask, don't you want to know what lunar mountains are about the same height as the Peak of Teneriffe, or as Etna, or as Mount Washington? You need not be afraid of puzzling me. I studied up the subject thoroughly and therefore know all about it. Oh, I could listen to you with delight all day long, cried Ardan enthusiastically, though with some embarrassment, for he felt a twinge of conscience in acting so falsely towards his beloved friend. The fact is, he went on, such a rational conversation as the present, on such an absorbing subject with such a perfect master. The sun, cried 1,000 Nicholl, starting up and cheering. He's cleared the disk completely and he's now himself again. Long life to him, hurrah! Hurrah, cried the others quite as enthusiastically. Ardan did not seem a bit desirous to finish his sentence. They tossed their maps aside and hastened to the window. Chapter 17. Tycho. It was now exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. The sun, completely clear of all contact with the lunar disk, steeped the whole projectile in his golden rays. The travellers, vertically over the moon's south pole, were, as Barbicane soon ascertained, about 30 miles distant from it, the exact distance they had been from the North Pole, a proof that the elliptic curve still maintained itself with mathematical rigour. For some time, the travellers' whole attention was concentrated on the glorious sun. His light was inexpressibly cheering, and his heat, soon penetrating the walls of the projectile, infused a new and sweet life into their chilled and exhausted frames. The ice rapidly disappeared, and the windows soon resumed their former perfect transparency. Oh, how good the pleasant sunlight is, cried the captain, sinking on a seat in a quiet ecstasy of enjoyment. How I pity Ardan's poor friends the Selenites during that night so long and so icy. How impatient they must be to see the sun back again. Yes, said Ardan, also sitting down the better to bask in the vivifying rays. His light no doubt brings them to life and keeps them alive. Without light or heat during all that dreary winter, they must freeze stiff like the frogs or become torpid like the bears. I can't imagine how they could get through it otherwise. I'm glad we're through it anyhow, observed 1000 Nicholl. I may at once acknowledge that I felt perfectly miserable as long as it lasted. I can now easily understand how the combined cold and darkness killed Dr. Kane's Esquimaux dogs. It was near killing me. I was so miserable that at last I could neither talk myself nor bear to hear others talk. My own case exactly, said Barbicane. That is, he added hastily, correcting himself, I tried to talk because I found Arden so interested, but in spite of all we said and saw and had to think of, Byron's terrible dream would continually rise up before me. The bright sun was extinguished and the stars wandered all darkling in the eternal space. Rayless and pathless and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and brought no day. And men forgot their passions in the dread of this their desolation, and all hearts were chilled into a selfish prayer for light. As he pronounced these words in accents at once monotonous and melancholy, Arden, fully appreciative, quietly gesticulated in perfect cadence with the rhythm. Then the three men remained completely silent for several minutes, buried in recollection, or lost in thought, or magnetized by the bright sun. They seemed to be half asleep while steeping their limbs in his vitalizing beams. Barbicane was the first to dissolve the reverie by jumping up. His sharp eye had noticed that the base of the projectile, instead of keeping rigidly perpendicular to the lunar surface, turned away a little, so as to render the elliptical orbit somewhat elongated. This he made his companions immediately observe, and also called their attention to the fact that from this point they could easily have seen the earth had it been full, but that now, drowned in the sun's beams, it was quite invisible. A more attractive spectacle, however, soon engaged their undivided attention, that of the moon's southern regions, now brought within about the third of a mile by their telescopes. Immediately resuming their posts by the windows, they carefully noted every feature presented by the fantastic panorama that stretched itself out in endless lengths beneath their wondering eyes. They seemed half asleep. Mount Leibnitz and Mount Doerfel form two separate groups developed in the regions of the extreme south. The first extends westwardly from the pole to the 84th parallel. The second, on the southeastern border, starting from the pole, reaches the neighborhood of the 65th. In the entangled valleys of their clustered peaks appeared the dazzling sheets of white, noted by Father Secchi, but their peculiar nature Barbicane could now examine with a greater prospect of certainty than the illustrious Roman astronomer had ever enjoyed. They are beds of snow, he said at last in a decided tone. Snow, exclaimed 1000 Nicholl. Yes, snow, or rather glaciers heavily coated with glittering ice. See how vividly they reflect the sun's rays. Consolidated beds of lava could never shine with such dazzling uniformity. Therefore there must be both water and air on the moon's surface. Not much, perhaps very little if you insist on it, but the fact that there is some can now no longer be questioned. This assertion of Barbicane's, made so positively by a man who never decided unless when thoroughly convinced, was a great triumph for Arden, who, as the gracious reader doubtless remembers, had had a famous dispute with 1000 Nicholl on that very subject at Tampa. His eyes brightened and a smile of pleasure played around his lips, but with a great effort at self-restraint, he kept perfectly silent and would not permit himself even to look in the direction of the captain. As for 1000 Nicholl, he was apparently too much absorbed in Doerfel and Leibnitz to mind anything else. These mountains rose from plains of moderate extent, bounded by an indefinite succession of walled hollows and ring ramparts. They are the only chains met in this region of ridge-brimmed craters and circles. Distinguished by no particular feature, they project a few pointed peaks here and there, some of which exceed 4.5 miles in height. This altitude, however, foreshortened as it was by the vertical position of the projectile, could not be noticed just then, even if correct observation had been permitted by the dazzling surface. Once more again before the traveller's eyes, the moon's disk revealed itself in all the old familiar features so characteristic of lunar landscapes. No blending of tones, no softening of colors, no graduation of shadows, every line glaring in white or black, by reason of the total absence of refracted light. And yet the wonderfully peculiar character of this desolate world imparted to it a weird attraction, as strangely fascinating as ever. Over this chaotic region the travelers were now sweeping as if borne on the wings of a storm. The peaks defiled beneath them, the yawning chasms revealed their ruin-strewn floors, the fissured cracks untwisted themselves, the ramparts showed all their sides, the mysterious holes presented their impenetrable depths. The clustered mountain summits and rings rapidly decomposed themselves, but in a moment again all had become more inextricably entangled than ever. Everything appeared to be the finished handiwork of volcanic agency, in the utmost purity and highest perfection. None of the mollifying effects of air or water could here be noticed. No smooth-capped mountains, no gently winding river channels, no vast prairie lands of deposited sediment, no traces of vegetation, no signs of agriculture, no vestiges of a great city. Nothing but vast beds of glistering lava, now rough like immense piles of scoriae and clinker, now smooth like crystal mirrors, and reflecting the sun's rays with the same intolerable glare, not the faintest speck of life. A world absolutely and completely dead, fixed, still, motionless, save when a gigantic landslide, breaking off the vertical wall of a crater, plunged down into the soundless depths, with all the fury too of a crashing avalanche, with all the speed of a Niagara, but in the total absence of atmosphere, noiseless as a feather, as a snowflake, as a grain of impalpable dust. Careful observations, taken by Barbicane and repeated by his companions, soon satisfied them that the ridgy outline of the mountains on the moon's border, though perhaps due to different forces from those acting in the center, still presented a character generally uniform. The same bulwark-surrounded hollows, the same abrupt projections of surface. Yet a different arrangement, as Barbicane pointed out to his companions, might be naturally expected. In the central portion of the disk, the moon's crust before solidification must have been subjected to two attractions, that of the moon herself and that of the earth, acting, however, in contrary directions and therefore, in a certain sense, serving to neutralize each other. Towards the border of her disk, on the contrary, the terrestrial attraction, having acted in a direction perpendicular to that of the lunar, should have exerted greater power, and therefore given a different shape to the general contour. But no remarkable difference had so far been perceived by terrestrial observers, and none could now be detected by our travellers. Therefore the moon must have found in herself alone the principle of her shape and of her superficial development, that is, she owed nothing to external influences. Arago was perfectly right, therefore, concluded Barbicane, in the remarkable opinion to which he gave expression 30 years ago. No external action whatever has contributed to the formation of the moon's diversified surface. But don't you think, Barbicane, asked the captain, that every force, internal or external, that might modify the moon's shape has ceased long ago? I am rather inclined to that opinion, said Barbicane. It is not, however, a new one. Descartes maintained that as the earth is an extinct sun, so is the moon an extinct earth. My own opinion at present is that the moon is now the image of death, but I can't say if she has ever been the abode of life. The abode of life, cried Ardan, who had great repugnance in accepting the idea that the moon was no better than a heap of cinders and ashes. Why, look there. If those are not as neat a set of the ruins of an abandoned city as ever I saw, I should like to know what they are. Once more the pipes of an aqueduct. Once more the pipes of an aqueduct. He pointed to some very remarkable rocky formations in the neighborhood of Short, a ring mountain rising to an altitude considerably higher than that of Mont Blanc. Even Barbicane and 1000 Nicholl could detect some regularity and semblance of order in the arrangement of these rocks, but this, of course, they looked on as a mere freak of nature, like the Lurley Rock, the Giant's Causeway, or the Old Man of the Franconia Mountains. Ardan, however, would not accept such an easy mode of getting rid of a difficulty. See the ruins on that bluff, he exclaimed. Those steep sides must have been washed by a great river in the prehistoric times. That was the fortress. Farther down lay the city. There are the dismantled ramparts. Why, there's the very coping of a portico still intact. Don't you see 3 broken pillars lying beside their pedestals? There, a little to the left of those arches that evidently once bore the pipes of an aqueduct. You don't see them? Well, look a little to the right, and there is something that you can see. As I'm a living man, I have no difficulty in discerning the gigantic battlements of a great bridge that formerly spanned that immense river. Chapter 999. He really see all this. To this day he affirms stoutly that he did, and even greater wonders besides. His companions, however, without denying that he had good grounds for his assertion on this subject, or questioning the general accuracy of his observations, content themselves with saying that the reason why they had failed to discover the wonderful city was that Arden's telescope was of a strange and peculiar construction. Being somewhat short-sighted, he had had it manufactured expressly for his own use, but it was of such singular power that his companions could not use it without hurting their eyes. But whether the ruins were real or not, the moments were evidently too precious to be lost in idle discussion. The great city of the Selenites soon disappeared on the remote horizon, and, what was of far greater importance, the distance of the projectile from the moon's disk began to increase so sensibly that the smaller details of the surface were soon lost in a confused mass, and it was only the lofty heights, the wide craters, the great ring mountains, and the vast plains that still continued to give sharp, distinctive outlines. A little to their left, the travellers could now plainly distinguish one of the most remarkable of the moon's craters, Newton, so well known to all lunar astronomers. Its ramparts, forming a perfect circle, rise to such a height, at least 22,000 feet, as to seem insurmountable. You can, no doubt, notice for yourselves, said Barbicane, that the external height of this mountain is far from being equal to the depth of its crater. The enormous pit, in fact, seems to be a soundless sea of pitchy black, the bottom of which the sun's rays have never reached. There, as Humboldt says, reigns eternal darkness, so absolute that earthshine or even sunlight is never able to dispel it. Had Michael's friends, the old mythologists, ever known anything about it, they would doubtless have made it the entrance to the infernal regions. On the whole surface of our earth, there is no mountain even remotely resembling it. It is a perfect type of the lunar crater. Like most of them, it shows that the peculiar formation of the moon's surface is due, first, to the cooling of the lunar crust, secondly, to the cracking from internal pressure, and thirdly, to the violent volcanic action in consequence. This must have been of a far fiercer nature than it has ever been with us. The matter was ejected to a vast height till great mountains were formed, and still the action went on, until at last the floor of the crater sank to a depth far lower than the level of the external plane. You may be right, said Arden by way of reply. As for me, I'm looking out for another city, but I'm sorry to say that our projectile is increasing its distance so fast that, even if one lay at my feet at this moment, I doubt very much if I could see it a bit better than either you or the captain. Newton was soon past, and the projectile followed a course that took it directly over the ring mountain Mortis. A little to the west the travellers could easily distinguish the summits of Blancanus, 7,000 feet high, and towards 7 o'clock in the evening, they were approaching the neighbourhood of Clavius. This walled plain, one of the most remarkable on the moon, lies 55 degrees S by 15 degrees E. Its height is estimated at 16,000 feet, but it is considered to be about 150 miles in diameter. Of this vast crater, the travellers, now at a distance of 250 miles, reduced to 212 by their telescopes, had a magnificent bird's-eye view. Our terrestrial volcanoes, said Barbicane, as you can now readily judge for yourselves, are no more than molehills when compared with those of the moon. Measure the old craters formed by the early eruptions of Vesuvius and Etna, and you will find them little more than 3 miles in diameter. The crater of Cantal in central France is only about 6 miles in width. The famous valley in Ceylon, called the crater, though not at all due to volcanic action, is 44 miles across and is considered to be the greatest in the world. But even this is very little in comparison to the diameter of Clavius lying beneath us at the present moment. How much is its diameter? Asked the captain. At least 142 miles, replied Barbicane. It is probably the greatest in the moon, but many others measure more than 100 miles across. Dear boys, said Arden, half to himself, half to the others, only imagine the delicious state of things on the surface of the gentle moon when these craters, brimming over with hissing lava, were vomiting forth, all at the same time, showers of melted stones, clouds of blinding smoke, and sheets of blasting flame. What an intensely overpowering spectacle was here presented once, but now how are the mighty fallen? Our moon, as at present beheld, seems to be nothing more than the skinny spectre left after a brilliant display of fireworks, when the spluttering crackers, the glittering wheels, the hissing serpents, the revolving suns, and the dazzling stars are all played out, and nothing remains to tell of the gorgeous spectacle but a few blackened sticks and half a dozen half-burned bits of pasteboard. I should like to hear one of you trying to explain the cause, the reason, the principle, the philosophy of such tremendous cataclysms. Barbicane's only reply was a series of nods, for in truth he had not heard a single word of Arden's philosophically explosion. His ears were with his eyes, and these were obstinately bent on the gigantic ramparts of Clavius, formed of concentric mountain ridges, which were actually leagues in depth. On the floor of the vast cavity could be seen hundreds of smaller craters, marteling it like a skimming dish, and pierced here and there by sharp peaks, one of which could hardly be less than 15,000 feet high. All around, the plain was desolate in the extreme. You could not conceive how anything could be barrener than these serrated outlines, or gloomier than these shattered mountains, until you looked at the plain that encircled them. Arden hardly exaggerated when he called it the scene of a battle fought thousands of years ago, but still white with the hideous bones of overthrown peaks, slaughtered mountains and mutilated precipices. Hills amid the air encountered hills, hurled to and fro in ejaculation dire, murmured 1,000 Nicholl, who could quote you Milton quite as readily as the Bible. This must have been the spot, muttered Barbicane to himself, where the brittle shell of the cooling sphere, being thicker than usual, offered greater resistance to an eruption of the red-hot nucleus. Hence these piled-up buttresses, and these orderless heaps of consolidated lava and ejected scoriae. The projectile advanced, but the scene of desolation seemed to remain unchanged. Craters, ring mountains, pitted plateaus dotted with shapeless wrecks succeeded each other without interruption. For level plain, for dark sea, for smooth plateau the eye here sought in vain. It was a Swiss Greenland, an Icelandic Norway, a Sahara of shattered crust studded with countless hills of glassy lava. At last, in the very center of this blistered region, right too at its very culmination, the travelers came on the brightest and most remarkable mountain of the moon. In the dazzling Tycho, they found it an easy matter to recognize the famous lunar point, which the world will forever designate by the name of the distinguished astronomer of Denmark. This brilliant luminosity of the southern hemisphere, no one that ever gazes at the full moon in a cloudless sky can help noticing. Arden, who had always particularly admired it, now hailed it as an old friend, and almost exhausted breath, imagination and vocabulary in the epithets with which he greeted this cynosure of the lunar mountains. "Hail," he cried, "thou blazing focus of glittering streaks, thou coruscating nucleus of irradiation, thou starting point of rays divergent, thou egress of meteoric flashes, hub of the silver wheel that ever rolls in silent majesty over the starry plains of night, paragon of jewels enchased in a carcanet of dazzling brilliance, eye of the universe, beaming with heavenly resplendescence. Who shall say what thou art, Diana's nimbus, the golden clasp of her floating robes, the blazing head of the great bolt that rivets the lunar hemispheres in union inseverable, or canst thou have been some errant bolide, which missing its way, buted blindly against the lunar face and there stuck fast like a mini ball mashed against a cast-iron target? Alas, nobody knows. Not even Barbicane is able to penetrate thy mystery. But one thing I know, thy dazzling glare so sore my eyes hath made that longer on thy light to gaze I do not dare. Captain, have you any smoked glass?" In spite of this anticlimax, Arden's companions could hardly consider his utterings either as ridiculous or over-enthusiastic. They could easily excuse his excitement on the subject. And so could we, if we only remember that Tycho, though nearly 250,000 miles distant, is such a luminous point on the lunar disk, that almost any moonlit night it can be easily perceived by the unaided terrestrial eye. What then must have been its splendor in the eyes of our travelers, whose telescopes brought it actually 4,000 times nearer? No wonder that with smoked glasses, they endeavored to soften off its effulgent glare, then in hushed silence, or at most uttering at intervals a few interjections expressive of their intense admiration, they remained for some time completely engrossed in the overwhelming spectacle. For the time being, every sentiment, impression, thought, feeling on their part, was concentrated in the eye, just as at other times under violent excitement, every throb of our life is concentrated in the heart. Tycho belongs to the system of lunar craters that is called radiating, like Aristarchus or Copernicus, which had been already seen and highly admired by our travelers at their first approach to the moon. But it is decidedly the most remarkable and conspicuous of them all. It occupies the great focus of disruption, whence it sends out great streaks thousands of miles in length, and it gives the most unmistakable evidence of the terribly eruptive nature of those forces that once shattered the moon's solidified shell in this portion of the lunar surface. Situated in the southern latitude of 43 degrees by an eastern longitude of 12 degrees, Tycho's crater, somewhat elliptical in shape, is 54 miles in diameter and upwards of 16,000 feet in depth. Its lofty ramparts are buttressed by other mountains, Mont Blancs in size, all grouped around it, and all streaked with the great divergent fissures that radiate from it as a center. Of what this incomparable mountain really is, With all these lines of projections converging towards it, and with all these prominent points of relief protruding within its crater, photography has, so far, been able to give us only a very unsatisfactory idea. The reason, too, is very simple. It is only at full moon that Tycho reveals himself in all his splendor. The shadows therefore vanishing, the perspective foreshortenings disappear, and the views become little better than a dead blank. This is the more to be regretted, as this wonderful region is well worthy of being represented with the greatest possible photographic accuracy. It is a vast agglomeration of holes, craters, ring formations, a complicated intersection of crests, in short, a distracting volcanic network flung over the blistered soil. The ebullitions of the central eruption still evidently preserve their original form. As they first appeared, so they lie. Crystallizing as they cooled, they have stereotyped in imperishable characters the aspect formerly presented by the whole moon's surface under the influences of recent plutonic upheaval. Our travelers were far more fortunate than the photographers. The distance separating them from the peaks of Tycho's concentric terraces was not so considerable as to conceal the principal details from a very satisfactory view. They could easily distinguish the annular ramparts of the external circumvallation, the mountains buttressing the gigantic walls internally as well as externally, the vast esplanades descending irregularly and abruptly to the sunken plains all around. They could even detect a difference of a few hundred feet in altitude, in favor of the western or right-hand side over the eastern. They could also see that these dividing ridges were actually inaccessible and completely unsurmountable, at least by ordinary terrestrian efforts. No system of castrametation ever devised by Polybius or Vauban could bear the slightest comparison with such vast fortifications. A city built on the floor of the circular cavity could be no more reached by the outside lunarians than if it had been built in the planet Mars. This idea set Arden off again. Yes, said he, such a city would be at once completely inaccessible, and still not inconveniently situated in a plateau full of aspects decidedly picturesque. Even in the depths of this immense crater, nature, as you can see, has left no flat and empty void. You can easily trace its special orography, its various mountain systems which turn it into a regular world on a small scale. Notice its cones, its central hills, its valleys, its substructures already cut and dry, and therefore quietly prepared to receive the masterpieces of Selenite architecture. Down there to the left is a lovely spot for a St. Peter's, to the right, a magnificent site for a forum. Here a Louvre could be built capable of entrancing Michelangelo himself. There a citadel could be raised to which even Gibraltar would be a molehill. In the middle rises a sharp peak which can hardly be less than a mile in height, a grand pedestal for the statue of some Selenite Vincent de Paul or George Washington. And around them all is a mighty mountain ring at least 3 miles high, but which, to an eye looking from the center of our vast city, could not appear to be more than 500 or 600 feet. Enormous Circus, where mighty Rome herself in her palmiest days, though increased tenfold, would have no reason to complain for want of room. He stopped for a few seconds, perhaps to take breath, and then resumed. Oh, what an abode of serene happiness could be constructed within this shadow-fringed ring of the mighty mountains! Oh, blessed refuge, unassailable by aught of human ills! What a calm, unruffled life could be enjoyed within thy hallowed precincts, even by those cynics, those haters of humanity, those disgusted reconstructors of society, those misanthropes and misogynists old and young, who are continually writing whining verses in odd corners of the newspapers. Right at last, Arden, my boy, cried 1000 Nicholl, quietly rubbing the glass of his spectacles. I should like to see the whole lot of them carted in there without a moment's delay. It couldn't hold the half of them, observed Barbicane dryly. Chapter 18. Puzzling Questions. It was not until the projectile had passed a little beyond Tycho's immense concavity that Barbicane and his friends had a good opportunity for observing the brilliant streaks sent so wonderfully flying in all directions from this celebrated mountain as a common center. They examined them for some time with the closest attention. What could be the nature of this radiating aureola? By what geological phenomena could this blazing coma have been possibly produced? Such questions were the most natural things in the world for Barbicane and his companions to propound to themselves, as indeed they have been to every astronomer from the beginning of time, and probably will be to the end. What did they see? What you can see, what anybody can see on a clear night when the moon is full. Only our friends had all the advantages of a closer view. From Tycho, as a focus, radiated in all directions as from the head of a peeled orange, more than 100 luminous streaks or channels, edges raised, middle depressed, or perhaps vice versa, owing to an optical illusion, some at least 12 miles wide, some fully 30. In certain directions, they ran for a distance of at least 600 miles, and seemed, especially towards the west, northwest, and north, to cover half the southern hemisphere. One of these flashes extended as far as Neander on the 40th meridian. Another, curving around so as to furrow the Mare Nectaris, came to an end on the chain of the Pyrenees, after a course of perhaps a little more than 700 miles. On the east, some of them barred with luminous network the Mare Nubium and even the Mare Humorum. The most puzzling feature of these glittering streaks was that they ran their course directly onward, apparently neither obstructed by valley, crater, or mountain ridge however high. They all started, as said before, from one common focus, Tycho's crater. From this they certainly all seemed to emanate. Could they be rivers of lava once vomited from that center by resistless volcanic agency and afterwards crystallized into glassy rock? This idea of Herschel's, Barbicane had no hesitation in qualifying as exceedingly absurd. Rivers running in perfectly straight lines, across plains, and up as well as down mountains. Other astronomers, he continued, have looked on these streaks as a peculiar kind of moraines, that is, long lines of erratic blocks belched forth with mighty power at the period of Tycho's own upheaval. "How do you like that theory, Barbicane?" asked the captain. "It's not a particle better than Herschel's," was the reply. "No volcanic action could project rocks to a distance of 600 or 700 miles, not to talk of laying them down so regularly that we can't detect a break in them." "Happy thought," cried Arden suddenly. "It seems to me that I can tell the cause of these radiating streaks." "Let us hear it," said Barbicane. "Certainly," was Arden's reply. "These streaks are all only the parts of what we call a star, as made by a stone striking ice, or by a bowl, a pane of glass." "Not bad," smiled Barbicane approvingly. "Only where is the hand that flung the stone or threw the bowl?" "The hand is hardly necessary," replied Arden, by no means disconcerted. "But as for the bowl, what do you say to a comet?" Here 1000 Nicholl laughed so loud that Arden was seriously irritated. However, before he could say anything cutting enough to make the captain mind his manners, Barbicane had quickly resumed. "Dear friend, let the comets alone, I beg of you. The old astronomers fled to them on all occasions and made them explain every difficulty." "The comets were all used up long ago," interrupted 1000 Nicholl. "Yes," went on Barbicane as serenely as a judge, "comets, they said, had fallen on the surface in meteoric showers and crushed in the crater cavities. Comets had dried up the water. Comets had whisked off the atmosphere. Comets had done everything, all pure assumption. In your case, however, friend Michael, no comet whatever is necessary. The shock that gave rise to your great star may have come from the interior rather than the exterior. A violent contraction of the lunar crust in the process of cooling may have given birth to your gigantic star formation." "I accept the amendment," said Arden, now in the best of humor and looking triumphantly at 1000 Nicholl. "An English scientist," continued Barbicane, Nasmyth by name, "is decidedly of your opinion, especially ever since a little experiment of his own has confirmed him in it. He filled a glass globe with water, hermetically sealed it, and then plunged it into a hot bath. The enclosed water, expanding at a greater rate than the glass, burst the latter, but in doing so, it made a vast number of cracks, all diverging in every direction from the focus of disruption. Something like this he conceives to have taken place around Tycho. As the crust cooled, it cracked. The lava from the interior, oozing out, spread itself on both sides of the cracks. This certainly explains pretty satisfactorily why those flat glistening streaks are of much greater width than the fissures through which the lava had at first made its way to the surface." "Well done for an Englishman," cried Arden in great spirits. "He's no Englishman," said 1000 Nicholl, glad to have an opportunity of coming off with some credit. "He is the famous Scotch engineer who invented the steam hammer, the steam ram, and discovered the willow leaves in the sun's disk." "Better and better," said Arden, "but powers of Vulcan, what makes it so hot I'm actually roasting?" This observation was hardly necessary to make his companions conscious that by this time they felt extremely uncomfortable. The heat had become quite oppressive. Between the natural caloric of the sun and the reflected caloric of the moon, the projectile was fast turning into a regular bake oven. This transition from intense cold to intense heat was already about quite as much as they could bear. "What shall we do, Barbicane?" asked Arden, seeing that for some time no one else appeared inclined to say a word. Nothing, at least yet a while, friend Arden, replied Barbicane. I have been watching the thermometer carefully for the last few minutes, and though we are at present at 38 degrees centigrade, or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, I have noticed that the mercury is slowly falling. You can also easily remark for yourself that the floor of the projectile is turning away more and more from the lunar surface. From this I conclude quite confidently, and I see that the captain agrees with me, that all danger of death from intense heat, though decidedly alarming 10 minutes ago, is over for the present, and for some time at least, it may be dismissed from further consideration. I'm not very sorry for it, said Arden cheerfully. Neither to be baked like a pie in an oven nor roasted like a fat goose before a fire is the kind of death I should like to die of. Yet from such a death you would suffer no more than your friends, the Selenites are exposed to every day of their lives, said the captain, evidently determined on getting up an argument. I understand the full bearing of your allusion, my dear captain, replied Arden quickly, but not at all in a tone showing that he was disposed to second 1,000 Nicholl's expectations. He was, in fact, fast losing all his old habits of positivism. Latterly he had seen much, but he had reflected more. The deeper he had reflected, the more inclined he had become to accept the conclusion that the less he knew. Hence he had decided that if 1,000 Nicholl wanted an argument it should not be with him. All speculative disputes he should henceforth avoid. He would listen with pleasure to all that could be urged on each side. He might even skirmish a little here and there as the spirit moved him. But a regular pitched battle on a subject purely speculative, he was fully determined never again to enter into. Yes, dear captain, he continued, that pointed arrow of yours has by no means missed its mark, but I can't deny that my faith is beginning to be what you call a little shaky in the existence of my friends the Selenites. However, I should like to have your square opinion on the matter. Barbicane's also. We have witnessed many strange lunar phenomena lately, closer and clearer than mortal eye ever rested on them before. Has what we have seen confirmed any theory of yours or confounded any hypothesis? Have you seen enough to induce you to adopt decided conclusions? I will put the question formally. Do you, or do you not, think that the moon resembles the earth in being the abode of animals and intelligent beings? Come, answer, messieurs. Yes or no? I think we can answer your question categorically, replied Barbicane, if you modify its form a little. Put the question any way you please, said Arden. Only you answer it, I'm not particular about the form. Good, said Barbicane. The question being a double one demands a double answer. First, is the moon inhabitable? Second, has the moon ever been inhabited?